Good afternoon. I'm Simone Cavallaro, Director of the Stigler Center. Before we start, I would like to express our gratitude once again to the healthcare and frontline workers, both in the US and abroad. Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in today for this webinar in our series, The Political Economy of COVID-19, which explores the global economic and political implications of the pandemic with leading academics and experts. Today, we're happy to host the Markup's chief editor, Julia Angwin, and UChicago law professor, Lior Strahilevitz, for a conversation moderated by the Intercept's chief editor, Betsy Reed, on the COVID-19 epidemic and the future that may hold for surveillance and privacy. Before we begin, please note, we're on the record and live streaming to the Stigler Center YouTube channel. Please feel free to share the broadcast on your social media. If you have any questions for the speakers, please submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The last 15 minutes of the webinar will be devoted to answering those questions. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. As you may know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives to help both students and the greater community stay connected and informed in this difficult period, including weekly episodes of our podcast, Capital Isn't, co-hosted by Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, focused on coronavirus-related topics. New Coronavirus and COVID Economy section on our online publication, promarket.org. More upcoming webinars in this series with speakers including Thomas Piketty, Stacy Mitchell, Steve Kaplan, and others. So please continue checking our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay informed. Back to this afternoon. We look forward to an engaging conversation. But before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Julia Angwin is an award-winning investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of the Markup, a no-profit newsroom that investigates the impact of technology on society. She was previously a senior reporter at ProPublica, where she led an investigative team that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and won a Loeb Award in 2018. She spent 13 years as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where she was on a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of corporate corruption. Julia is also the author of Dragnet Nation, a quest for privacy, security, and freedom in a world of relentless surveillance, and other works. Lior Strahilevitz is the Sidley Austin Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. His teaching and research interests include privacy, property and land use, trade secrets, contracts, and others. He clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and practiced law in Seattle before joining the Chicago Law School faculty in 2002. He also served as the law school's deputy dean and was elected to the American Law Institute. Lior also chaired the subcommittee on privacy and data protection on the Stigler Center Committee on the digital platform, and we thank him for his service. Our moderator today is Betsy Reed, editor-in-chief of the Intercept since 2015. Under her leadership, the Intercept has earned millions of readers reporting on topics such as surveillance, technology, war, US politics, and the environment, and more. During her tenure, the Intercept has won a George Polk Award, a National Magazine Award, a Sidley Hillman Prize, and an Edward Murrow Award. Prior to joining the Intercept, Reed was an executive editor of The Nation. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, and welcome everybody. As we find ourselves in this brave new world where Zoom is our space to have dialogues like these, given some of the decisions, the momentous decisions being made right now in the midst of this crisis or under cover of it, depending on your perspective, one of the most critical issues to consider is obviously surveillance and privacy and what these decisions being made now will mean for us permanently as a society once this finally passes. As the editor of the Intercept, which was founded in part as a platform for reporting on Edward Snowden's disclosures, I find myself on the more skeptical end of the spectrum when it comes to the use of mass surveillance for what are said to be purposes serving the public good. But even I and my colleagues in the first terrifying moments of this pandemic were asking the questions on everyone's minds, like, while everything else has failed, so what can technology do for us here? We all followed intriguing news stories about clever devices like the Kinza smart thermometer, which was collecting data that helped to predict outbreaks ahead of public health authorities. And with our public health infrastructure in shambles and our government's response incompetent at best, the temptation to seek a silver bullet salvation from tech are extreme and nearly universal. The trouble is that, as we know, very few people and institutions make the best decisions in moments of panic. And right now, the robust democratic debate that we were engaged in just a few months ago over the staggering and unaccountable power of big tech platforms and the need to protect the public interest, and particularly the interests of disadvantaged groups, in an economy that's been shaped by these secret algorithms and mass data collection, this debate has virtually disappeared at the very moment when the social problems created by these dynamics are exploding. So that's why we're so lucky today to have the chance to discuss these issues with two people who have devoted their substantial intellectual energy and acumen to illuminating this often mystifying topic for the rest of us. I'm going to turn first to Julia, who, as you all know, is the founder of the Markup and also the foremost journalist covering these issues of technology and privacy in the country, and someone who's always paid special attention to the way these things like algorithms, which other people, are find totally invisible and mystifying, are actually shaping our lives in the most fundamental ways and often reinforcing inequalities that we see all around us. Julia, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on a big picture level about how you see this moment, how the pandemic or has the pandemic exacerbated some of the threats to privacy you've documented in your work. What are the threats and challenges or even opportunities of what's going on right now, and what should we do about it?
Thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be here. I would just like to say I am a University of Chicago alum, so I'm having a lot of nostalgia looking at Lior's background, remembering my days on campus. This moment, as you said, Betsy, is one that is, unprecedented and has really changed the whole nature of the public debate around surveillance. Up until the pandemic, we were in what I would say is probably a techlash, where people were really questioning the power of the big tech companies and whether they knew too much about us and whether they were unregulated monopolies. And now, the way I think of it is that we're in a bit of a 9/11 moment. So after 9/11, when this nation faced a crisis, what we did, which we only learned later through some of the reporting like the Intercept did, is that we learned that the US secretly sort of enacted a whole bunch of mass surveillance programs in order to try to protect themselves against future terrorist events. And I think we're in a situation right now where we have this unknown health crisis, and people are turning again to technology and surveillance as a solution. And it's very tempting to think that we could technology our way through this. And certainly health technology is going to be the solution, vaccines and things like that. But the debate around contact tracing is probably the one that is the most live right now, in terms of like, how can we track this disease without actually tracking and building a national database of every single person's actual movements, right? And that is the central debate that is being played out around the world right now. Almost every country is trying to figure out a way to do contact tracing. And some have decided to go with human surveillance, some have gone with cell phone surveillance, and it's sort of on the bubble here in the US. And I think this is the challenge that we face as a society, is that in a crisis, we all want to reach for a solution, and we don't always know what the implications will be. But it is worth noting that we've never built a national, complete database of everyone's live movements, and the ramifications of that are sort of almost boggling to the mind.
Great. So turning to Lior, could you give us some context for understanding the legal and policy frameworks that are in place, and the extent to which they have the capacity to govern the kinds of things that are happening now, and where they're lacking?
Sure, thanks, Betsy. I think one of the things that surprises a lot of people when they turn to the issue of contact tracing and privacy is that the existing legal frameworks, at least in the United States, don't provide very substantial impediments to at least narrow and focused use of surveilled data, so long as the data is only used for public health purposes, i.e. to try and control the epidemic. So, for example, I think a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with HIPAA. If you've ever gone into a doctor's office, you probably have signed a HIPAA waiver of some sort, or you may have signed some of those when dealing with your health insurer. But it turns out that built into HIPAA's privacy rule are broad exceptions for state public health agencies or the CDC to gather data, collect data, disseminate information about someone who may have an infectious disease to other people who they may come into contact with. And in some circumstances, public health rationale may allow them to do that without the patient's consent. Similarly, if you look at state health laws, they'll often have these kinds of public health exceptions. And the question of technological surveillance is certainly something that the Constitution speaks to. That's one of the core lines of Fourth Amendment case law, Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And there too, I think there's a real divide between those instances where technological surveillance is used for the purposes of counteracting a threat to public health versus for law enforcement purposes. If this kind of technology is used for law enforcement purposes, we want to identify criminality. We want to see if we can identify those people who are violating a quarantine order. Then the judiciary looks at these issues with a lot of skepticism. Whereas when it's the case that this kind of technology is used solely for public health purposes and really limited to that, then the judiciary and the case law tends to be much more permissive with respect to what the government wants to do.
But isn't the key question, I mean, we've heard before that there are limited purposes for certain data, and then lo and behold, it becomes used for entirely other purposes. That seems to have happened over and over again. And similarly with anonymization, right? I mean, that is supposedly protecting individual information, but then it has failed. It has had many holes, which Julia, you've written about, right?
Yeah, I mean, anonymization is, whenever people collect these mass databases, they usually say, oh, the data is going to be anonymized. But the truth is that the field in computer science of re-identifying supposedly anonymous data sets is a robust one, and is making a lot of breakthroughs all the time. And there's a lot of data sets that have been re-identified. And so the idea that just you would be able to anonymize this data and make it safe is definitely been proven to be not true, largely through the work of LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard and others. But I think there's also this mission creep that you're talking about, Betsy, which is like, you know, these data sets are always kind of collected for some narrow reason, and then they are later repurposed for something else. And I mean, even the Kinsa thermometer that you were talking about, like, I don't think anyone bought that thermometer because they wanted to contribute to like a New York Times data visualization of like how the flu was spreading. And so people don't realize, you know, it's sort of like the model of notice and consent that we have for data usage right now sort of implies that the people who are sharing their data have any real control and are reading these privacy policies and making some decision. In fact, they're not. We don't have really the ability to negotiate. When you buy a smart TV or a smart thermometer, you don't actually get to negotiate with the person on the other side and say, I don't want to agree to these terms. And so more and more of our devices are taking our data and repurposing it and reselling it for other purposes.
Lior, I mean, is that anticipated in these laws? And you know, when narrow use is approved, I mean, isn't this a sort of blind spot also of the legal system?
I think in the U.S. context it is, and so the kind of mission creep that Julia describes, I think we certainly saw that play out after September the 11th. The USA Patriot Act turned into, well, here's all these investigative tools that the Justice Department has wanted for a long, long time. Some of them are clearly oriented towards the terrorism threat, and some of them aren't really. And so it was an opportunity amidst very substantial public anxiety to give the DOJ the wish list and to have it fly through Congress, whereas otherwise it wouldn't. What I will say is that we can look to other countries and see how they're approaching some of these issues. So I think tomorrow there's going to be in Australia a parliamentary debate on contact tracing and the contact tracing app that has already been released in Australia, and it looks like about a little under 30% of Australian adults have already downloaded their app. Now, one of the things that's proposed in the government's legislation in Australia is to make it a crime to take data that's collected from these smartphone apps for public health purposes and use it for any purpose other than contact tracing and potential exposure notification. You can make it a crime, and all of a sudden that'll substantially reduce the possibility that this data is going to get used for a non-COVID related purpose. Another thing that that's being built into the Australian legislation, and presumably that'll get passed tomorrow in their legislature, is a provision that any data that's collected by these apps be deleted after 21 days. Why 21 days? Well, we think that the potential incubation period of COVID is usually around 5 days, up to 14 days, but it might take another week for test results, for a test to occur and for test results to come back. And so they've identified that 21-day period, and the best way to prevent all the problems that Julia is identifying is to not create a database. So I think the move towards privacy protective contact tracing apps is to think about no centralized databases, rather having the information be stored remotely on people's phones, to not have sharing occur without user consent. Once you create this database with tons of alluring data, people are going to come after it. But a combination of criminal sanctions and mandatory deletion after 21 days won't solve all the problems, but it'll address a lot of the problems to a significant degree.
But isn't that a serious political challenge? I mean, there in this country, limits like that are not even on the table. And in fact, the Senate is considering this Data Privacy Protection Act, which is, well, my understanding is that it's anything but that. But I would love to hear what you all think about the prospect for that type of regulation in this country.
Lior, you could speak to the prospect of legislation better than I.
Yeah, so I mean, I think honestly, this is a domain where I don't have a lot of confidence, Betsy, like you in the government. I actually, in this instance, have a little more confidence, though far from total confidence, in Apple and Google, which have developed the contact tracing API. So I don't think that the limitations that they're placing on the use of data through their contact tracing API are perfect. But it's clear that they've been listening to privacy advocates and people who are concerned about privacy. And so through software, they've decided to unilaterally implement some of the kinds of changes that I just described the Australian government as having debated. And so, yeah, I'm not sure the House and the Senate in this environment are going to get it right. And I'm not convinced Apple and Google are going to get it right either. But my sense is they're probably going to get it closer to right. And one of the reasons why is that there are constituencies within those companies that really do care about privacy. But I think another reason why is that one of the things we're seeing from the early survey data is that Americans are extremely reluctant to install an app if they think that the data might be used for commercial purposes, or if they think that the data might be used for law enforcement purposes, or if they think the data is going to wind up in the kind of database that will present an enticing target to hackers. So yeah, I think even if you don't have a lot of faith in government, you might put some faith in what some of the tech companies are doing, at least on this project. I don't want to say that that Google respects user privacy across a bunch of domains, because I've written about and studied cases where they haven't. In this instance, though, I think there's much more public scrutiny than would usually be the case. And that's maybe causing them to listen to the angel on their shoulder rather than the devil on their shoulder, at least with respect to this API. And Julie, I know you've thought a lot about the API too, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I agree with you that the Apple and Google proposal is a very thoughtful one. It is essentially, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a mostly decentralized. They tried really hard not to build a central database of users and their locations, and it's mostly kind of a peer-to-peer, phone-to-phone way to alert people who you've been near recently that you've been diagnosed. And it's a clever solution, but it's only part of the solution. And as we've seen with France recently, like it's not what actually governments want, right? So basically, the Apple and Google basically built the back end for these apps, but they've said that the apps themselves should be built by the public health authorities. Well, public health authorities don't want just this decentralized notification system. They actually want to track themselves what's happening, how many people are infected, and would like to build a database. Because the truth is that like this sort of decentralized phone-to-phone thing really relies on self-report. So you have to go into your phone and say, I've been diagnosed and I want to alert people. And there's not a lot of controls over like whether you are lying or whether you might be trying to disrupt something. And then also whether you were really close to those people for long enough. Like if you pass somebody in the grocery store or whatever, you might be sending a lot of alerts to people. And there's a real possibility that people are going to be overwhelmed with false alerts and start to ignore them. And so public health authorities would like to address this is my understanding, through putting more humans involved in this situation, right? They want to have human contact tracers, and the app would be supplemental in some ways, but they also need to keep track of where everyone's at. So France, for instance, has just asked Apple and Google to relax some of the privacy protections so they can use the back end of the app. And I think this is going to be a fight that a lot of countries are probably going to have, because the truth is that the app itself is designed for a certain way of usage that is not actually how a lot of public health authorities run contact tracing.
So, I mean, switching gears a little bit, since we know that that a lot of the massive amounts of data that have been collected by big tech platforms have been used to sort of predict behavior and actually divide people into personality buckets and create, behavior types and psychology types. How can we be sure that some of the data being collected now won't be used in that way in the future? And do we need new legal and policy safeguards, or and also, like, relatedly, what are the concerns about disadvantaged groups in all this? Because we've seen, also it could kind of skew our understanding of where this epidemic lies, that certain populations may not have smartphones to the same degree as other populations. Could you comment on that generally? Julia, both of you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? So smartphones are, they're pretty broadly distributed, but they're not ubiquitous, and particularly in communities of people with less money to spend on phones, they're less popular. And there's also the fact that this isn't a technology that everyone's going to choose to download, right? That if people are not going to be aware of it, or what level of education there will be about whether you would want to use it, and the truth is that in the US, there's just, for all communities, vulnerable and not vulnerable, there's a huge number of reasons to be skeptical of apps and their use of your data. Because the truth is, right now, the default position is that your app is actually kind of abusing your data. Most of, I don't know if you guys have seen there's those charts the New York Times did about like how all these people were violating social distancing, and they had little dots of everyone's movements. That was basically people's apps in their phone. They have a secondary market where they sell your location data to big sort of location data brokers, and those people build these aggregate charts of what people are doing. And that's a pretty robust market, the secondary location market, stolen from your apps that you don't even know about. So there is so much already of data leakage from apps that there's we just haven't built a system that would enable anyone to trust it, right? So like, that's the problem. When you start with a system that has no safeguards and there's no reason to trust it, and then you're like, but I'm going to build the super safe, trustworthy one, but there's no framework around that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. And certainly the disparities that, that Betsy and you and Julia are talking about are real. We know from the incidence data, for example, in New York City, that racial minority groups, members of racial minority groups, are more likely to contract COVID and less likely to be able to work from home. So they're out of necessity, economic necessity for us, economic necessity for them. They're having to expose themselves to risks, and not surprisingly, after being exposed to these risks, they're more likely to come into contact with someone who's died. And if you look at the survey results, there's a big black-white gap about whether people know someone who's contracted the disease, whether people know someone who's died from the disease. So too with smartphones, I think the biggest disparity here, there's really two of them. There's the cost of a smartphone, which Julia alludes to, but it's also the case that senior citizens are much less likely to have smartphones than people under 65. And of course, we know from the mortality statistics that seniors are also by far at the greatest risk if they do contract the disease. So thinking about that is a big challenge. And if anything, we ought to think seriously about, sort of not technological programming as the be-all end-all. If anything, sort of the strongest case for some of these tech-related approaches would be, well, they can perhaps free up sort of old-fashioned contact tracers who will maybe be able to redouble their efforts with respect to senior citizens and other populations where either people are less likely to have smartphones, or if they do have smartphones, perhaps because of decades of distrust of government, they're much less likely to install them. That could represent some progress in terms of freeing up resources among overwhelmed sort of brick and mortar style contact tracers. But absolutely, these disparities are something that we ought to be concerned about, angry about, and that ought to affect the way we think about how to address the pandemic.
So I appreciate what you both said about how Apple and Google, are making some moves in the right direction and seem more sensitive to the arguments of privacy advocates. But at the same time, we have right now this increasing sort of, melding of the big tech platforms and the government, right? And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo invited Eric Schmidt to be the chair of the new Blue Ribbon Commission to completely remake the state and transform digital learning and all these different aspects of technology using now, actually, reappropriating goals that they had before and just sort of, refashioning them for this moment and presenting it as like a necessity of public health. And we've seen many other examples, like the US government teaming up with Palantir, which was a company that was, co-created with the national security state, which has, had a long trail of problems and violations. So in all of this, where is the voice of consumer advocates and privacy advocates? And isn't there a risk that right now these decisions are being made just between these big tech companies and governments without anything kind of stopping them from running roughshod over civil liberties? Julia?
What's even crazier than what you're saying is that I think you could make a pretty good case that the tech companies are more power than the government, right? And so, normally we worry about the government co-opting companies for their own ends, but in this particular case, the tech companies have already for 10 years have really regulated speech across the globe, right? If they decide that a certain piece of content is fake or that they don't think it violates their standards, they'll take it down in any country, regardless of the laws. That's been mitigated a little bit. Some countries have more ability to fight back than others. But right now, Facebook and Google are making unilateral decisions about what hoaxes and misinformation to take down about the virus. And honestly, those are very well-intentioned decisions, I think, but it is worth noting that we have not really ever been in a place like this where there's these entities that have more power than any particular government to sort of shape the way we speak to each other and politically across the globe. And there's not really any check on their power, right? So they aren't regulated by the US, which is where their base is. The EU attempts to regulate these companies, but doesn't have as much leverage because they're not located there. And also these companies are just very powerful. And they aren't transparent about the way they make these decisions. Facebook, I guess, just announced they're building this. They built their own Supreme Court, right? That will adjudicate their decisions. But once again, they built it, right? This is just entirely a creation of them. It is not three branches of government, and so it is a crazy world that we're in right now, where we are sort of dependent on their benevolence. And so I think that Cuomo choosing Eric Schmidt is it's actually just the political reality, right? These are the most powerful people in the world. So I guess might as well just get them to try to help you because we're all sort of dependent on them,
Yeah, so I think all that's super important. I guess here I'd kind of try and think about two different sorts of issues. So the narrow and the broad. The narrow in terms of things that we've been discussing, like contact tracing apps. There's really two approaches that governments have taken. For the most part, democratic governments have decided that they're going to only do smartphone surveillance with the consent of individual users. And I feel much better about that approach than the approach that China has taken. I do think Israel is doing some non-consensual surveillance. At least they have been doing some non-consensual surveillance. South Korea has been doing a few things that I would describe as non-consensual. Ultimately, with respect to things like contact tracing apps, the individual has the ability to say no by refusing to install an app on their device, or installing it and then deleting it if they feel as though it's being misused or has the potential to be misused. Now, you know, these apps have the potential to save a lot of lives. You know, we'd like people to install them if we're to keep the death toll down. But by the same token, it's very understandable why people may be reluctant to. And so I think from a design perspective, we know that the things that people are going to really care about are, if I install this, will it only be used for narrow purposes? And if I provide data to you, will there be adequate data protection to make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands or get used for some other purpose? Okay, so that's one approach, and I think that the fact that the individual has the veto power with respect to contact tracing data should make us feel better. But as Julia points out, there's so much other data that's swimming around that we create with our smartphones or we create with our web browsing that is getting harvested for all kinds of commercial purposes every day. And that's the general as opposed to the specific point. In general, people don't understand how their data is being used. They would object to some of the ways in which their data gets transferred after they use a device that allows it to be aggregated. And they'd be really disappointed to find out how much people can learn about them or people in their neighborhoods through, you know, a few keystrokes. So I do think that's a big problem. And the United States has generally adopted a relatively laissez-faire approach to regulation. And so as we move beyond the sort of narrow but substantial emergency of COVID, thinking about how to give people more awareness of what's happening and then effective autonomy to prevent choices that they wouldn't approve of and their data being used in ways that would surprise them and upset them, that to me is going to be one of the great legislative challenges of the next decade. Maybe the COVID situation makes people a little bit less concerned about civil liberties than they otherwise would be, because this is a state of emergency and there are a lot of lives at stake. But when we're in non-emergency times, I do think government regulators have largely not been up to the task in this country of protecting people against these nasty surprises that can happen with their data.
Do either of you think that it is possible or likely that that too much attention and emphasis is being placed on the potential of these apps to save us? I mean, you referred, Lior, to, you know, the fact that they could potentially save thousands of lives. You know, perhaps, I mean, I do see the utility in practice of some of these devices and technologies, but at a much more basic level, you know, we're lacking testing, we're lacking sort of public health infrastructure, and you know, you have this debate being kind of driven by the power of big tech, which you know, clearly has a vested interest in these kinds of partnerships with government, because you know, they may not be immediately seeking to profit from these apps, but you know, they certainly are not only in it for the public good, right? So, I mean, do you see that as sort of maybe warping the priorities of our national discussion?
I mean, I definitely think that like talking about the app without talking about all the infrastructure that goes around it is kind of nonsensical, right? This app relies on testing, and then we don't have anywhere near the amount of testing that we need in this country. And it just does not appear to be ramping up either. And And then it basically relies on what are you going to do when you get this notice on your phone that says you've been exposed, right? We don't have actually, like in other countries, they've had like isolation. You can go to a hotel, they'll feed you, you stay and you're isolated. We don't have any of that. You're just going to stay where you are doing exactly what you were doing before. Maybe you're going to go to the grocery store less, right? I don't know, right? And so it's like, it's not clear what you're supposed to do once you get that notice, because we haven't built any sort of social systems to take care, to basically do quarantine if we know someone's exposed. And so it's sort of like, well, it's fine to have a little bit of a heads up that you might have been exposed to something, but it isn't anywhere near a solution. It's just kind of one part of like a public health infrastructure that doesn't really exist.
I think that's absolutely right and important. You know, I think if you wanted to make the strongest case for the efficacy of these contact tracing apps, I think you'd look to the Israeli data, and according to some of the government reports coming out of Israel, they've identified about a third of the people who are COVID-19 positive through non-consensual smartphone surveillance. So they're tapping into their Israeli security service, the Mossad, which had a secret database that's monitoring everyone's movements. And that database has been put to this use. And even, I mean, you want to say from a public health perspective, this is a best case scenario. From a privacy perspective, it may be a worst case scenario. And the most kind of invasive, non-consensual data gathering that you can imagine is only responsible for identifying about a third of the positive people who've been identified. The other 2/3 presumably have been identified through more traditional sourcing and strategies. Okay, I don't think in the United States we're prepared to deal with non-consensual contact tracing. And it's absolutely right that once people get these positives, they need information that will, or not these positives, these notices that someone near them has tested positive. They need resources. They need information about where to go. And then when they go there, they need there to not be a 3-hour line. They need to understand that even if they don't have health insurance, that the government or the hospital or someone else is ultimately going to pay for their treatment, pay for whatever medications they may need so that their family isn't bankrupted. Otherwise, they may get a positive notification and think, look, I just can't afford to be tested. I can't afford to be tested positive. I'm just gonna have to, go about my business. And that's a worst case scenario, because if they are positive, they'll continue to spread it to others.
Can I just jump in with a quote that I love from Ross Anderson? He's a security researcher at the University of Cambridge. He did an analysis of the contact tracing apps, and he basically came to the conclusion that really we should just spend the money on public health. And what his line here from this article is, what we need is a radical redistribution of resources from the surveillance industrial complex to public health. And I feel like that, the amount of money, right, that Apple, Google honestly throw off in a month would probably be something that would, we could have all those engineers working on this API, or maybe they could actually help fund like people's healthcare, right? Because that is actually, the problem is, as you said, Lior, people can't afford to go to the doctor, and they can't afford the bills that come afterwards. And also there isn't any sort of protocol. Every hospital has to come up with their own protocol for who they're going to test and under what conditions. We at the Markup did a 50-state survey of public records requests, every state in the US, to find out who are they testing and why, because the tests are so stringently allocated. And in some states, if you're elderly, you can get a test. In some states, if you're a healthcare worker, but it's completely all over the board. And so we're just in a situation where there's no consistency, and there's really like no leadership on that front.
I'm going to go to the questions from the audience now. There's been a number of really interesting ones. Nate McCarthy asks, I'm wondering how the United States dependency on private tech companies for economic infrastructure, such as Amazon, may formalize these corporations' structural dominance and, for lack of a better term, create a de facto state-endorsed channel for private firms to collect consumer data. He also asks, I'm curious on what privacy regulation might look like in such dramatically transnational circumstances. Do you see a potential for data sharing between global jurisdictions, and how might the effects of this download be to individuals?
I'll take the first part, which just escaped me. Wait, remind me. The first part was
about the dependency on Amazon.
Oh, the dependency, right. So I feel like there's already some evidence that it's really hard for regulators to regulate tech companies because they're so reliant on them, particularly for campaigning, right? So right now, as we've seen in the 2016 presidential election, Facebook is like a key battleground. Buying Facebook ads is a big part of a political campaign these days, and I'm sure will be even more so now that we're all locked at home and the only way we can ever have any discourse is over social media. So so there are many reasons why I think in the US there hasn't been regulation of the tech companies, but I do think that one of those reasons is that it's a key tool that the lawmakers use, and also it doesn't hurt that the big tech companies are the biggest campaign finance contributors.
The main way, or the main, at least at the federal level, agency that regulates privacy in the US is the Federal Trade Commission. And I think, placed in the global perspective, the FTC has a lot of smart, hardworking people there. They have way less enforcement authority than just about any privacy cop on the beat if we look at other countries. So one of the main things that the FTC does is it enforces the promises that tech companies make in their privacy policies, and to the extent that a privacy policy, which almost no one reads, except for privacy organizations and advocates and lawyers, to the extent that a company violates one of the promises they make there may well be an FTC enforcement action, and they may have to enter into a consent decree, which is going to require a higher level of oversight than usual. And then if they violate a subsequent consent decree, then and only then can they be fined by the FTC, which is for example what allowed the FTC to go after Facebook for Cambridge Analytica. It was that there had been a previous privacy snafu that had prompted Facebook to sign on to a consent decree. So, in general, I'd say the privacy regulation scheme that we have in the US is fairly narrow and not particularly aggressive. We ask the FTC to do a lot, and we don't give it much resources or much statutory authority. We have a lot of privacy class actions brought by plaintiffs' attorneys. Those are good for the plaintiffs' attorneys and maybe deter some of the worst misconduct. They don't really tend to provide consumers with much in the way of substantial relief. So in general, it is the case that the United States just doesn't regulate privacy particularly aggressively at the federal level. And I do think a lot of that's by design. It's because, by and large, the companies that are influential in the political process would not like to see a more muscular regulation at the federal level. I think the second part of the question about sort of transnational information sharing is an interesting one. Certainly, there are some limitations on the ability of the government to do that, especially when it comes to sharing data with Europe. So there have been a number of cases making their way through the European courts about, for example, sharing airline passenger data. When European citizens fly to Canada, what can be collected, what can be shared. That is an area where the law has some bite, and it has some bite because either European law or national privacy regimes that are modeled on European law tend to be much more muscular than the US approach. And so sometimes the law can get in the way of what tech companies left to their own devices might want to do there.
Another question from the audience. Lior mentioned public scrutiny possibly nudging Google toward being more responsible. Do you think this is a solution toward change rather than just laws, more public scrutiny?
I mean, this is a softball for me because obviously as a journalist, I think public scrutiny is really important, and it's a goal for us in the journalism profession to shine light on things that wouldn't otherwise be seen by the public, and hopefully encourage the public to advocate for change when it's in their interests. I do think that, you know, having covered the tech companies for 20 years, 10 years ago, if this had happened, I don't think Apple and Google would have proposed such a privacy protecting measure. I think that they have come a long way through public pressure. And that is a good thing. Is it all the way where they need to be? No. And is public pressure the only way that citizens should have to hold a company accountable? Probably not. But it's something more than it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's important to understand here is Google is a they and not an it. So within Google, there's going to be some people who really take privacy very seriously and others who really want to, you know, maximize shareholder profits. And sometimes those two things are going to be aligned, which makes it easy. And sometimes those two things are going to be in conflict with one another, which will make it harder. You know, one of the things that Google, Apple, all these companies, Microsoft really care about is, well, what are the beliefs not only of their customers, which matters, what are the beliefs of regulators, which can matter, what are the beliefs of our engineers? You know, we're in this highly competitive market for hotshot coding talent, and you know, these newly minted computer science grads can go anywhere. Maybe they'll be more likely to come to Google or Apple, Microsoft, or Amazon if they see us as a company that's making a positive difference in the world. And so every time, you know, Betsy, your publication or Julia's publication, you know, puts a target on one of these companies' backs, they're not only worried about, you know, sort of what is the public thinking, but they're worried about what their own employees are thinking, especially those most talented employees who they'd be really worried about losing. So there can be, I think, a kind of nice synergy between public pressure and internal pressure. The more a company is seen as wearing a dark hat as opposed to a white hat, it's not only the case that they'll only be hearing that from outside the company, they'll be hearing that inside the company too, and they care a lot about retaining talent and keeping their talent on board with the sometimes mission-driven messages that get conveyed internally at tech companies.
Yeah, and certainly Google employees have been very active in protesting, you know, their work with the Pentagon and, you know, and the censored Chinese search engine. I was curious, Lior, as a follow-up to the last question, looking at the sort of transnational picture, we have seen since a lot of these tech companies are global companies, do they have to raise their practices all over the world in order to meet standards that more stringent standards that are placed in, say, Europe? I mean, this has happened with other industries and health and safety regulations because the EU has sort of led the way. Do you see that still happening? And then are there ways that governments are trying to undercut that? Like, for example, the COVID Data Privacy Act that I just mentioned in the Senate, I believe would preempt the more stringent privacy protections that have been passed by the state of California. So yeah, I'd just be curious your comment on that, that phenomenon.
Yeah, so good. So I think it's absolutely the case that with respect to privacy, Europe has been the regulator that really matters, much more so than the United States. You know, people who are tuning in who are interested in this topic, there's a brand new book by Anu Bradford at Columbia's law school, Columbia University's law school, called The Brussels Effect, that really digs into this, not only with respect to privacy, but with respect to a whole host of issues. And her thesis in that book is that really by regulating more aggressively and by having such a big market, the EU has rendered the US largely irrelevant in a global regulatory space. So I think, yes, your thesis is very much borne out by the careful work that's been done. I do think the issue of what's happening in California getting attention in Washington is also a big thing. So I think until California's enactment of the CCPA and other moves in California, there was just very little appetite, especially on one side of the aisle in Washington, DC, to do anything to regulate privacy. But as soon as companies started fearing not only would there be aggressive regulation in California, but then Washington State was going to be aggressive and Vermont was going to do something aggressive, and perhaps something was coming down the pike in Illinois, but it was going to be 50 different sets of regulations and 20 different sets of aggressive regulations, each requiring different things. The tech companies looked at that world and they said, oh my gosh, this is so complicated. The law is going to get so fragmented. Maybe what we do want now is federal legislation that'll have some bite to it. Now that hasn't yet come to fruition, but it wouldn't be surprising that in the next 5 or 10 years, as there's more and more pressure from Sacramento, Olympia, Albany, some of these jurisdictions that are going to push the envelope a little bit, that we might come to see at the federal level something that more closely resembles GDPR in Europe.
Another question from the audience. Any thoughts on how people should seize agency in a future where information on their movements and personal life has very much been commodified and used by institutional entities for commercial purposes?
Such a difficult question. In my book, Dragnet Nation, I spent a year trying to protect my privacy. So I tried sort of every possible measure that I could within the realm of like somewhat normal human behavior to see how I could protect it. And honestly, location movement data is so difficult to protect if you're going to carry a cell phone. So I did a burner phone, which was just not in my name. But the truth is, I go to all the same places. Well, obviously now I never go anywhere, but back then I would, go to the same places. And there's some research from Microsoft researchers who showed that 4 unique data points are enough to identify most people. 95% of people can be uniquely identified. So if you give, basically the sad point being that if you give out sort of any location data, you'll pretty much have identified yourself. And so, and the world that we live in right now is one where your cell phone talks to the wireless carrier, local Wi-Fi, local Bluetooth, and so it's sending out signals in all the apps, right? Who knows how many apps, and they're all selling that data too. So it's a sort of unregulated space that is really difficult to control. And so one thing that I feel like people ask me all the time, what can I do to protect myself? And I feel like the problem is people try to frame this issue as an individual choice, like as if you have given away your privacy. But the truth is you don't have a lot of agency in that situation. And I hate to give that answer because I want to give people hope. But when it comes to location, like the only thing I ended up doing was putting my phone in a Faraday cage, which is a bag that blocks the signal. And then it's kind of useless.
Yeah, I think not to sound too pessimistic, but I think Julia is absolutely right that the demands that we place on consumers are completely unrealistic. And then when consumers do wind up sharing data, because it's almost impossible not to, we pretend that they've consented to all these unanticipated uses. A lot of the work I've been doing in the last year or so, much of it co-authored with Jamie Liguori, is about dark patterns and ways in which dark patterns successfully manipulate people into disclosing information about themselves or permitting data to be collected about themselves, in ways that they don't understand, in ways that are confusing, in ways they don't anticipate. If people are interested in that, we have a free paper online called Shining a Light on Dark Patterns. But one of the things that we reveal in our research is how often people will be manipulated into sharing data by just simple but really sort of evil tools like continuous prompts. Do you want to share data? Yes or not now? Well, okay, you click on not now, and then a week later, would you like to share data? Yes or not now? It turns out that architecture like that built into the software is hugely effective at getting people to share their data. Maybe they don't agree to it the first time, maybe they don't agree to it the second time, but by the third, fourth, or fifth time they see it, they think, well, they're going to keep asking me, and I do want to use this website, so I'll go ahead and say yes. And then once you say yes, they never ask you, do you want to undo data sharing? They've gotten the answer that they're happy with, and you've just given them permission to share a whole bunch of your data. So there's really interesting research on dark patterns. There's our stuff. Aranesh Mathur and a bunch of co-authors have a really terrific paper called Dark Patterns at Scale that's worth reading. And so I think the most people can do is educate themselves about some of these different ways that tech companies are going to come after you and get you to do things that you probably don't want to do and that might not be in your own interest. But I think there are limits even on what really savvy consumers can do to try and protect the privacy of their whereabouts, the privacy of their economic activity, the privacy of who they're associating with.
So we just have about time for one more question. And I want to ask both of you, Julia and Lior, for your thoughts, sort of in sum, what do you find the most sort of scary development going on right now in terms of concerns about privacy and surveillance in the midst of this pandemic? What should we be most alert to, and what deserves more public attention and scrutiny and debate?
Now, I'm really worried about facial recognition. Facial recognition, it's a way of tracking people's location, tracking people's whereabouts, tracking people's associates without their knowledge or consent. The surveillance can be surreptitious. Obviously, there's false identifications that occur with facial recognition. But when I hear potential collaborations between the government and Clearview AI to use facial recognition for contract tracing and quarantine enforcement purposes, I really shudder, because I think those kinds of tools are going to so alarm the public, and I think those are the kinds of tools where the benefits of using them are not zero, but the harms from using those kinds of technologies are really substantial. I don't think the government should be employing those kinds of tools, even in a situation as dire as the one that our country finds itself in now.
Well, I would agree. I was probably going to choose facial recognition,
Sorry.
but I would say facial recognition is terrifying, but I would also say that the sort of widespread use of predictive algorithms is something that I think is underappreciated. We are so quickly going down the road of thinking that we can predict human behavior through collecting a few signals through people's phones or through other types of behavior, that because we can collect all this behavior, and there's a real mania to develop these predictive algorithms, and they're really insane, right? Like the algorithm that I've written about is one that tries to predict if you're going to be a criminal in the future. Will you commit a crime in the next 2 years? And my research at ProPublica, we showed that it was biased against Black defendants, and the truth is that it's still being used today, and there are hundreds more predictive algorithms out there. Like, the train hasn't stopped rolling, and I think it is really scary to think about being judged on your future behavior. The philosophical implications of that means that we never allow anyone to change, grow, learn from their mistakes. And it's not, it feels like a world that will sentence a lot of people almost at birth. And I think it's a terrifying development and incredibly widespread.
Well, thank you both, Lior and Julia. This has been a fascinating hour. I really wish we had been able to do it live and we could shake hands and all that, but and see some of this audience in person. But thank you for joining remotely. And I think we've really begun to sort of scratch the surface of an enormously complex and critically important subject today. And I hope this discussion continues in other forms. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Betsy, and thanks, Julia.
Thank you.